church. It's good to be with y'all again. So this morning, we were looking at the loyal love of God throughout just different examples of the Old Testament. And his loyal love is connected to his covenants. And so I wanted to look at his covenant tonight and kind of how that relates to us and what that kind of means for us today. And this kind of all starts off in the Garden of Eden. God makes this prophecy or this promise of one day that the snake's head would be crushed by the seed of the woman. And so we see this start of the plan. And as we go through this, there's different steps and stages. It's a really cool process that the Bible goes through from the beginning to the end of this story. And Abraham is an important piece in this story. In fact, he's very relatable to us today, as the promise that is given to Abraham will come to us, as the New Testament will describe it, through Jesus. And so we will be kind of welcomed into this same covenant. And it will change in shape and form slightly, but we are considered children of Abraham, Israel. And so through this covenant that we have in Jesus, we become the children of Abraham. And so it's an interesting thing. And so I want to explore Abraham, the covenant made with Abraham and his faith journey, and how well that mirrors ours or relates to ours. And how it is just, it's really cool how closely tied they are, especially in the New Testament. Abraham, in multiple places, is described as one of the most faithful men in the Bible. And his walk with God was quite amazing, an amazing one, really. In Hebrews 11, we'll talk about him quite a bit. We won't have time to go over Hebrews 11, but you can go and read that. And it will tell the story of Abraham through the eyes of the author of Hebrews. So we're going to start with kind of the calling out of Abraham. And this happens in Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1. And so let's read there and see. Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1. And it says this: And Yahweh said to Abraham, Abram, go out from your land and from your relatives and from the house of your father to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse, and all the families of the earth will be blessed in you. And Abram went out as Yahweh had told him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he went out from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and all the persons that they had occupied at Haran. And they went out to the land of Canaan. And they went to the land of Canaan, and Abram traveled through the land up to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanites were in the land at this time, and Yahweh appeared to Abram, and said, To your offspring I will give this land. And he built an altar there to Yahweh, who had appeared to him. And he moved on from here to the hill country, east of Bethel. And he pitched his tents at Bethel on the west, and Ai on the east. And he built an altar there to Yahweh. And he called on the name of Yahweh, and Abram kept moving on toward the Negev. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell as an alien there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it happened that as he drew near to enter into Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, Look, now I know that you are a beautiful woman of appearance, and it shall happen that if the Egyptians see you, then they will say, This is his wife then. They will kill me, but let you live. Please say you are my sister, so that it will go well for me on your account. Then I will live on account of you. And it happened that as Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was beautiful. And the officials of Pharaoh saw her, and they praised her beauty to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to the house of Pharaoh, and he dealt with Abram on account of her. And he had sheep, cattle, male donkeys, male slaves, female donkeys, and camels. And then Yahweh afflicted Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues on account of the matter of Sarai, the wife of Abram. Then Pharaoh called for Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she was my sister, so that I took her to myself as a wife? Now then, "Here is your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and then sent him and his wife, all that was with him, away. So in chapter 12, we get an introduction to Abram. Actually, we get an introduction to his father Terah just shortly before, and we see that he comes from the Ur of the Chaldeans. And that place was a place full of idolatry. We know from other scriptures, I believe it's Jeremiah 23 or 24 that will mention this, but Abram was an idolater. He was not a faithful believer in God. This is developed recently. So Terah and Abram and his family, they come out of the land at the first calling of God, and they settle in Haran, which is not where God called them to, but that's where they stopped. In Genesis 12, we see him called again, and he will again go with God. And he seems to have a more developed faith at this point. He is following the commands of God. He's portrayed as starting to become faithful now. But just after following him and entering into this land, we see Abram lie about Sarah because he's afraid of the Egyptians. And God has promised him that he would become a great nation. But Abram doesn't trust God really at this point, so he lies about Sarah. And so we start to see he's started his faith walk, he's started his journey, but he's still hesitant in believing about God. And God provides and protects for him and Sarah throughout this process. God gets Sarah back to Abram. Abram now has riches and is sent away. What he did was not good. It was not what God wished for him to do. But Abram was provided for and protected by God. And so Abram, we see the beginning of his journey, and it's not that great. But we'll see another section to his story, and it kind of progresses a little bit more. So he's lied about Sarah, but now we're going to jump ahead to chapter 15, starting in verse 5. And we will see kind of really one of the pinnacle moments of his walk. It's another step up from just following God out of the place that he was called. So Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 5. And it says this: "And he brought him outside and said, 'Look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them.' And he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' And he believed in Yahweh, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he said to him, 'I am Yahweh who brought you up out of the Ur of the Chaldeans, to give this land to you, to possess it.' And he said, 'O Yahweh God, how shall I know that I will possess it?' And he said to him, 'Take for me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon.' And he took for him all these and cut them in pieces down the middle. And he put each piece opposite the other. But the birds he did not cut. And the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And it happened as the sun went down, then a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, a great and terrifying darkness fell upon him. And he said to Abram, 'You must surely know that your descendants shall be as aliens in a land, not their own. And they shall serve them as they shall oppress them 400 years. And also the nation that they serve I will judge. Then afterwards they shall go out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to be ancestors in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. And the 4th generation shall return here, for the guilt of the Amorites is not yet complete.' And after the sun had gone down, it was dusk. And behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between those half pieces. On that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates.'" So we see the next step in this. And Abram shows great faith in believing God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So that's really cool. This is, in fact, the first covenant that is described as a covenant. The rainbow is also a covenant, but it's not like this. This is a very personal and intimate covenant that he is making with Abram and his descendants. And we'll see it develop a little bit later on in the second year. But this is a really, really cool story. Abram asks, "How can I be assured of this promise?" And now, God had already told him this before he lied about Sarah. When he calls him out, "You will become a great nation." But Abram doesn't really understand this, and God said it, therefore it will happen. But now God's making a covenant, saying this is what will happen. And so this is a bit of a strange situation. You're like, well, what's going on with all these animals and cutting them in half and walking through them and whatnot? Well, this is, in fact, such an ancient way of making a covenant. We don't really know where it originates. Everybody at the time would have understood it, though. This is how they made covenants. And what they were saying was, in this covenant, that as we walk through, we are making this covenant and saying, if either one of us breaks our side of the covenant, if we are unfaithful to the promise that we've made, we will become like these animals, split in two and eaten by the birds of the heavens. And so it's interesting that only God goes through. Abram does not. He puts him into a deep sleep. And so this is very different than what the covenant would have normally looked like. This is God saying, I am promising this to you, Abram. And there's nothing that Abram is obligated to do except for trust in God at this point. And God's saying, no matter what, I will remain faithful. And even if you fail or stumble, you're not going to die. You're not going to be like these animals. But if I break my heart, I will be like these animals. And so God is making a very strong statement with this imagery, with this story. And it's really, really cool. He's saying, if anybody breaks this covenant, it's only my blood that will be spilled, not yours. And so he's making a promise of this land. And in this promise, he's also predicting the future. He tells us of how this story is going to be shaped, and everything that he says comes true. And we will see this as the story progresses. The people will be enslaved in Egypt for 4 generations, and then they will come to take possession of the land. But this isn't the last covenant. This is one of the first like this that's very relational. And this is where Abram is called righteous. So it's an important one. But it continues further. So going on down into Genesis chapter 17, we will see another part of this covenant. And so starting in verse 1, Genesis chapter 17, God says this. When Abram was 90 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram, and he said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless, so that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell upon his face, and God spoke with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant shall be with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Your name shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make you a nation, and kings shall go out from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you, between your offspring after you, throughout their generations, and as an everlasting covenant, to be a God for you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after the land in which you are living as an alien, all the lands of Canaan, an everlasting property, and I will be to them as God. And God said to Abram, Now, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you, also with your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. And at 8 days of age you shall yourselves circumcise every male belonging to your generations, and the servant born in your household, and the one brought from any foreigner who is not from your offspring. You must certainly circumcise the servant born in your house, and the one bought with your money. And my covenant shall be with your flesh as an everlasting covenant. And as for any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised, the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So we've seen this covenant now progressed. God once again restates it to Abram, but there is a requirement of Abram. And Abraham's name is changed, which is very significant. Every time there's a name change in the Bible, it's significant. And so now I want to really start to highlight some of our covenants. We have a name change when we enter into covenant with God. We go from us, sinful, to blameless, to white as snow. We go from just a regular person, evil of the world, a Gentile, to an Israelite, to one who is of God's people, a Christian, is what we were called. But God calls us his people. Our names have changed. Our identities have changed. And so it's the same with us. We also see in this covenant, there is a requirement to be in this covenant, and that is circumcision. And circumcision did not go away. We still have circumcision today within ours. Now, it looks differently, but really, it's the same. Because there was those of the Israelites, of Abraham's children, who were circumcised and were not of the people. And there was those who came from the outside and were grafted in and were circumcised as they were supposed to. But this is of the flesh, but the heart is really what mattered to God in the act of this. And we see that throughout the story. The Israelites, even though they were circumcised, they were, following that part of the covenant. The part they weren't following was giving God their heart. This was really an introduction to relationship. He's saying this was more about cutting away the sin and destructive tendencies of your life and giving them up and saying, God, I'm going to be in pursuit of you. I will be your people. And so this was an outward significance of what they were as a people on the inside. And it's the same for us. We'll read some passages here from the New Testament to kind of draw this in. So let's go to Colossians chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. And it will say this. Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 10. And you are filled in him, who is the head over every ruler and every authority, in whom also you were circumcised with a circumcision not made by hands, by the removal of the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ. You have been buried with him in baptism, in which also you were raised together with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And although you were dead in the trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, having destroyed the certificate of indebtedness and ordinances against us, which was hostile to us, and removed it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. So here the writer of Colossians is relating circumcision to baptism and the cutting away of the old flesh and the new life that we receive. You see, baptism is part of our entering into the covenant. It is our sign. And there will be another sign, we'll read about that in a second here, but I want to really draw out the significance here. The way that they did circumcision is the way that baptism is for us. They're relating the things and saying it is the same. That's what Colossians is trying to point out here. And we have it in Christ. We've become the people of Israel. And this is significance in that we are giving up the body of flesh for Jesus, for the life in him. And that means we will do some things. And it requires a heart. It requires a relationship, just like circumcision did to be his people. It required obedience as well. But this is our sign. This is the beginning of our walk. Just like circumcision was for them. And so baptism is really important, and we start to see that at the beginning. So let's go a little bit further into the New Testament. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 1. Starting in verse 13, Ephesians chapter 1 will tell us this. In whom also you, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, in whom also when you believed you were sealed with the promised Holy Spirit, who is the down payment of our inheritance until the redemption of the possession to the praise of his glory. You see, part of this circumcision is, in baptism, is we receive the Holy Spirit. And this Holy Spirit is our sign. It is God's signet saying, this one is mine and no one else's. This person is in covenant with me and no one else. And therefore, we are under God's protection. We are his people. Just like Israel was. And we see this in the example of Israel. If you know their story, it becomes quite clear how well this relates to us. If we abandon God, we're no longer under his protection, as we studied with the judgments of God last time. But when we are under his protection, when we are with him, when we are in pursuit of him, in relationship with him, and we have his Spirit on us, we are his people. We are protected. And so the author is bringing that point out here. And then Philippians 3:3. For we are the circumcision, the one who worships by the Spirit of God and boasts in Christ Jesus, and do not put confidence in the flesh. All of this is pointing to putting away human and earthly things and taking on the things of God, pursuing him in his ways. And we see those listed throughout the New Testament as they're talked about. We're saying we're going to take our evil deeds, our destructive deeds, and we are giving those up for the good deeds of God. And we'll look at that a little bit more as we continue on. And we have an identifying mark, like the Israelites did, God's own Spirit. I think this is just really, really cool. So we really start to see this idea of circumcision and how well it pairs to ours. The covenant that was made then is transitioned to us through Jesus. And the New Testament authors will make that claim. Let's look at Jeremiah 31 real quick. Jeremiah 31 has a good point here as well. Jeremiah chapter 31, starting in verse 31, we'll look at that real quick. Look, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, and I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their ancestors on the day of my grasping them by their hand, bringing them out from the land of Egypt. My covenant that they themselves broke, though I myself was master over them, declares Yahweh. But this is the covenant that I will make in the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. I will put my law in their inward parts, and on their hearts I will write it, and I will be to them God, and they themselves will be to me my people. And they will no longer teach each one his neighbor, or each one his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for all of them will know me, from their smallest up to their greatest, declares Yahweh. For I will forgive their iniquity and their sin. I will no longer remember. Jeremiah 31 here is prophesying of us as God's people, as Israel. In fact, you'll see the New Testament authors use this verse for us. Israel broke covenant with God, the covenant that is established at Mount Sinai, where they say, we will do all that you commanded. They abandon God over and over and over again, and he's patient with them all the way up till Matthew. And once you have Jesus and his death, that is the end of Israel as we know it from the Old Testament. It is taken on a new form, like Jeremiah prophesies here, and it becomes for us. We become Israel, entering into a covenant that is different and yet has similarities. So we learn a lot from the covenant with Israel. It's very important to ours. And their history is our history for a large degree. So going back to Abram, as we are starting to relate with this faith walk again, we'll go to Genesis chapter 20. And there he will lie about Sarah again. After God has promised these things, established circumcision, and Abram has just gone back and forth with God. He trusts him and then he doesn't. Also within here, within the past chapters, we see him have sexual relations with the servant of Sarai, thinking maybe I'll have a son through him. And that was not as God intended it. And now Ishmael was blessed by God, but as Ishmael becomes a great nation, Israel fought with them forever. It was not a good thing. It was a mistake that has plagued Israel to this day. The lack of faith and trust in God's promise on Abram and Sarah's part lasted for generations. And so Abram is struggling and wrestling with this faith. He succeeds and then he fails. He walks faithfully and then he walks away and doesn't trust. And then he comes back. And then we get to Genesis chapter 22. And in Genesis chapter 22, God calls him to offer up Isaac, his one and only son by Sarah, his unique son, as it might sometimes be translated. There is none other like him. And Isaac has a lot of imagery for us as he seems similar to Jesus. Now, Isaac is spared by the substitutionary lamb that comes out of the thicket provided by God. And this also has imagery of Jesus as well. Jesus died for us so that we could be saved, just as Isaac was saved with this lamb from the thicket. And that's just, it's really cool imagery. But here we are told that Abram's faith was proven. This is where his faith is perfected. And this is kind of the top. And then he'll go on and be faithful for the rest of his life until he dies, at least as far as the story goes. So as we've looked at the faith of a man where a covenant was established, and when we go into this covenant, it's established with us as his people. Just like as it was with Abram, we have a name change. We relate very much to Abram. As we walk in our faith, we're not perfect. We start off rougher, and then we slowly start to understand and walk more and more faithfully, just as Abram did. And God will lead us and guide us through all of it. God established a relationship with us. He doesn't expect perfection. He knows you're human. But he does expect you to pursue him and to pursue him faithfully. See, the most faithful man, if he wasn't perfect, we won't either. And now Jesus is actually the most faithful man to ever live. And he walked perfectly with God. But we don't live up to that standard. But we're called to be at that standard. And Abram saw his calling, saw the standard, and he strove for it. He didn't always achieve it, and neither do we. You judge a man by his walk and not by his stumble. Jesus takes care of the stumble. And that's really seen through Isaac very, very well. Abram's stumbles costs. God tested Abram because he hadn't been faithful. We see that in the New Testament passage. When they reflect back on this, they'll say that. But as you look at the lamb that was sacrificed in Isaac's place, Jesus is the same for us. We haven't been faithful, and for that there's a cost, and that cost is death, and that's blood. And Jesus' blood covers us. It is the propitiation, which is a fancy way of saying it fully sates what God required from us for our unfaithfulness. And that is so cool. It's such a cool imagery, and so cool how that all ties together. I want to do a little thought exercise. I think it's a pretty cool thing. I want you to close your eyes for a minute. Just go with me here into your minds, and as you're closing your eyes, think of being in an utterly dark room, an utterly dark place where there is no light. And you are seeking, you're searching for something. You've lost it, but you run into a table. That hurts. You bang your head on a lamp, or you run into something and glass shatters on the floor. You step on some glass, that kind of hurts. It cut up your feet. You just can't see anything. There's nothing there. And then you a light switch is flipped on. You can now see everywhere. And so you start to be able to take assessment of these things. And so in the darkness, you couldn't see anything, but now in the light, you can. Now imagine you're walking down a path in this light. It's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful sunny day. Clouds, blue skies, there's trees lining this path. And you're just taking in the glory of everything there. There's birds chirping and a butterfly. And as you're looking at this butterfly and this beauty, you trip and you fall. And you hit your face on the ground. That's not any funny face plant. But then you get back up and you brush yourself off and you keep on walking. So as you compare these two different stories, you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, God is described as light. We were in darkness before we knew God. We were those people who were stumbling, who were being self-destructive because we were running into things that we didn't know what we were running into, but it was harmful to us. It hurt. But then we got this light, and we're walking down this path, and we're walking towards great beauty, great perfection, and you are in the light of God. And, you get to see this beauty, but you stumble sometimes. You hit the ground, but the light doesn't go away. The light doesn't turn off. It's not like a light switch and the sun goes out and you fall down. The light's still shining on you. You're still in the light. You're still on the path. You're not in the dark house again. So this imagery really, I think, displays well for us that it's about the walk. not about the stumble. God does not judge the man by his failings. He judges him by the pursuit of his heart. Another great example is David. He committed many great sins that were horrible. He murdered a man, he stole his wife, he did other things. David was not always faithful, but he is known as a man after God's own heart. All of the people that we have counted in Hebrews as great heroes of the faith were utter and horrible failures by most accounts until they met Jesus. Or not Jesus, God. And he called them out of who and where they were. And then they're still the same people that they were before they were called. They just start to have a purpose. And they walk down this path. As we see them, they progress down their lives. And sometimes at the end of their life, they still had horrible things going on. Gideon, for example, his death, he's faithful. He does everything God calls him to. And then at the end of his life, he makes an ephod, and then people worship it as an idol. That's the end of Gideon's life. That's not a really great crowning achievement to have an idol worshipped. Now, he did turn down kingship. He was faithful, and he is brought up in Hebrews as a great hero of faith. God works with broken people, and the idea of perfection is not there. The idea of walking towards him and pursuing him wholeheartedly is. I love what Micah has to say in chapter 6, verse 8. And the call is really cool here. And it says this: He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does Yahweh ask from you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. When it says love kindness, that's loyal love showing up in him. God simply asks for you to do good, and to love him, and to love others, and to walk humbly with him. That is our calling. That is simply it. It's not complicated. And whenever we fail, God's got us. It is provided for in Jesus. But we must walk with him. That is the requirement. We must not leave him, and we must not leave his spirit. God has given us everything we need to have a relationship with him, to do good, to walk the walk. So let's walk according to what he's called us to. We have a covenant in Jesus, and it's similar to the one Abraham had. And God didn't change from then till now. His requirements then are not any different than now. He still requires our heart, our walk, our pursuit. And we still have circumcision, a circumcision of the heart. Trust, relationship, and obedience. We are to walk faithfully with him, just like Abram did. God's grace, compassion, and loyal love, his seal, that trumps any judgment that is to come. We have security in him. We can trust in that. We don't have to wonder if we're saved. We don't jump in and out of salvation. We're saved. We're sealed. We walk with him. As long as we're running towards him, we're good. And that is a great promise. That's a great gift. We have assurance, so don't doubt. Because judgments don't come from perfection, but from place of the heart. God judges the heart. We're told that. His covenant has always been based on heart. So today, if you're struggling with your walk this evening, if you need prayers or support in this walk, or to enter into the covenant today, if you're baptized, to join us on this walk, please reach out to someone here or come forward as we stand and sing.
Have you been